Emily Mason waited until all the others were gone before she approached, and she knelt down next to Ben, and she took his giant 3-fingered hand into hers. She stroked the stumps of his missing fingers. She talked to him.
Benji, the sirens are coming. They're coming for me. If you don't wake up, they're going to put me back in a cage. I don't want to go back in the cage, Benji. So I need you to listen to me. And I need you to wake up.
And he squeezed her hand so very gently. Ben struggled to his feet. He could just hardly manage it. His legs were shredded, down to the bone in places, missing chunks of skin and flesh, and his chest was oozing blood like a loose sponge. Emily could see the lump of a bullet that was nestled under the skin of his temple. It had missed his eye by half an inch, maybe, and burrowed down into Ben's oddly dense skin.
Oh, Benji, look at what they did to you.
This time, Ben couldn't help her. He couldn't carry her away to safety. He couldn't fight off the cops. He was just able to stand under his own power. So it was up to her.
Come on, I'm going to save you.
As dawn broke on the night of the long knives, Emily Mason, the twisted child genius, the sadist, the murderer, found herself playing a new role, savior. There were an army of cops on the way. The DRO was already watching her. Ben was full of bullets and near to dead. She had a best friend to rescue. She had a day to save. Because at this moment, she wasn't a monster. She was Emily, the hero. Drinking whiskey in the kitchen and telling scary stories around the fire. Music, monsters, and mayhem, killers, cannibals, and cults. Fearful fiction and furious fact, tall tales, and terrible truths. This is a scary home companion. Under the best of circumstances, it would have required a whole classroom full of Emilys to move Ben. So she had no choice but to motivate him to move himself. She led him down the street, not to the closest house, which had half-moon windows set at ground level to let light into the basement, and not to the second closest house, which she saw had a cellar door in the side yard. The third house was just right. She ran to the front door. She found it unlocked and the house beyond empty. Sirens were drawing ever closer. Less than a minute away now. But at the same time, Emily knew that they couldn't get organized and begin any sort of search for some time, maybe several hours. Nonetheless, the clock was ticking. She shut and locked the front door behind them and drew all the blinds. Ben was just standing in the front hallway, his head brushing the light fixture as he wobbled and wavered on his feet.
Ben, wait! I have a bed for you. It's downstairs.
She opened the door to the basement and led Ben down the long, rickety flight of wooden steps. It was perfect. thick cement walls with no exterior doors or windows. It was just empty storage space that had been used for boxes, old appliances, shelves of canned food so old that the labels had all peeled off. Wonderful. She cleared out a spot for Ben in the back corner behind one of the piles of junk. She threw down everything soft that she could find. Old couch cushions, blankets, garbage bags filled with donation clothes. She built him a sort of nest and then ordered him to lay down in it. From past experience, she was full aware that Ben could and often would stay awake for days on end and never show any sign of being tired or weakened. But then every once in a while, a few times a year, he would crash out and crash hard and sleep for 3, 4, 5 days on end. Emily was banking on this happening now.
Benji, listen to me. I have to go now, so they don't catch you. I have to trick them. I want you to stay here and sleep. It will get loud, and it might get very, very hot. Don't worry, you're gonna be okay. Please just sleep. There's food here when you wake up. I have to go, but I'll come back for you, okay? I promise, Ben. I promise.
She shut and locked the door at the top of the steps, and then took a moment to collect her thoughts. Outside, she could hear the cops. No sirens now, but a lot of different voices over a lot of different loudspeakers from a lot of different directions. The police were all over, combing the area, looking for survivors, calling for any and everyone to come out. It was chaos. And it was obvious to her that these first responders were just the frontline geeks. They didn't know anything. The DRO would have sent in silent kill squads if they were coming. After all, they already had those drones in the area, which was an entire other variable that Emily had to account for in this equation. But her immediate threat right now were these clueless cops bumbling around from house to house, trying to make sense of all the bodies they were finding. And at this point, there was no way that anybody would be looking for her in particular. But that wouldn't last. Once the police started talking to Marla Cole and that pudgy pizza boy, Sheldon Dent, and those awful Gordo-killing brats from the slumber party, well, once they gave their statements, things were going to change. So she had a lot to do. She started in the kitchen and then went into the garage because the first step involved collecting as many accelerants as possible. Once she had taken an inventory and knew exactly what she had to work with, then she picked up the phone and started making some calls. The previous night, she had spent a couple of hours in the sheriff's office alone with Ben, and while there she had the foresight to look through the APB files for the last 6 months from all across Michigan. In specific, she looked for every single missing girl in her age bracket. And she'd made mental notes of the different contact numbers and precincts where these girls went missing. So presently, she had 11 different police hotlines to call and a lot of missing girls to impersonate.
Hello? Oh my God. Please help me. This is Michaela. I saw the number you posted for me. Thank goodness. I thought everyone had forgotten about me. I was taken by a bad man. I think it's called Grace. He put his thing into me, but I said no. That's wrong. He said he was the boss of the whole town of Grace, and I had to do what he said. I told him This is Consella. I think the bad clown man is dead. He said his name was Gordo. He tried to do bad things to me. He took me to a town called Grace. There's a fire! Someone find me, please! This is Stevie.
She muddied the already chaotic waters in a remarkably short amount of time, with the intent being to generate as much pandemonium as possible, with a lot of different people looking for a lot of different little girls for a lot of different reasons. And the one 10-year-old girl they wouldn't be looking for was currently lugging 2 canvas grocery bags filled with accelerants: gasoline, kerosene, turpentine, nail polish remover, rubbing alcohol, and her personal favorite, non-dairy creamer. Something so sweet and delicious that burns so pretty, she loved it. While in that sheriff's office the night before, Emily had quickly but thoroughly studied several area road and topographical maps of the Grace Valley. So she knew precisely where she was and where she was going. She also knew the most strategic places in her immediate vicinity to start a forest fire. Muddying the waters was the goal, so she couldn't have a single obvious point of origin for the fire, so she picked 4 spots. She was planning on using the valley winds and the densest pockets of brush to start a conflagration that would devour the whole valley and the entire town. Before she left the house, she carefully doused the 2nd floor and then left a single thin trail of gasoline out the back. She carried those 2 ever-lightening bags to those 4 different locations and started a fire at each of them. After she made sure that the fire had caught and was spreading nicely, she moved on to the next. And things were starting to really heat up by the time she got back to the original house to start the last fire.
Be safe, Benji. Don't wake up until I come back. Please.
She watched quietly as the house turned into an inferno. And then she started to comically wave her arms in the air and scream and cry in a state of total panic. And she ran out into the street and waved down a passing police car that whisked her away to safety. A staging area had been set up in the north end of the Grace Valley. A blockade of first responders and National Guardsmen, a fleet of personnel carriers, cruisers, and ambulances, everybody working together to count and sort the dead and tend to the casualties. The cops took Emily from the back of their car and led her towards a group of young girls nearby. Apparently, they'd been separated out by their age and sex. Emily recognized more than a few of them. That girl Franny was there, and all those other Gordo-killing slumber party bitches. But she didn't resist or give anything away. She didn't want to be suspicious, but she did hurriedly scan the area to see if there was anything else she could use to her advantage, something. Yes, there it was. The pudgy pizza boy was on a gurney, unconscious, and being loaded into the back of an ambulance. So she whimpered to the cops.
That's my big brother. My name's Franny. That's my brother, Shelly. Please.
She pulled away from the cops and ran to the ambulance. The EMT was just about to shut the door, but Emily pleaded with her. "Wait, are you Franny?" the woman asked. "He's been asking about you." Emily jumped into the ambulance, and the EMT, she waved the two police officers away. The EMT had Emily take a seat and buckled her in as the ambulance started to drive through the crowd. "You can't talk to him now, hon. He's way, way out." Emily played the ever-doting sister and stared longingly at Shelley Dent. He looked awful. Bloody and bruised, cut and contused, so badly beaten. It was obvious that there was going to be no way to save his arm. Ben had really done a number on him, but she didn't giggle, although the memory of how this boy broke made her want to laugh. The EMT checked her out, took her vitals, assessed her for injury, but Emily was almost unblemished, although quite a bit dirtier and smellier than she would have liked. It took a while, almost half an hour worth of driving, before the paramedic moved up to the shotgun seat and left Emily alone with Shelley. She knelt down next to him and lovingly stroked the side of his face.
What a lucky boy you are. You know, most people would think that more police would be bad. It isn't. More police is good. Because police don't like each other. It's not just good guys and bad guys. The good guys always want to be the best of all good guys. So they compete with the other good guys. They hate the other good guys. And that's how bad guys can walk away without anyone knowing. If they're smart about it. See, it doesn't work out if they look at you. So the trick is to get them to look the other way. So I can't really kill you, Pizza Boy. But I really want to.
As soon as they reached the hospital and the ambulance doors opened, Emily sprung into action. She allowed a nurse to guide her by the elbow, going along with him just long enough that she could get the lay of the land and a good look at the ER setup. Once she had the layout, she immediately knew her plan of action. A good plan has benchmarks and keystones, but is adaptable in all details. That's what Miss Mercy had taught her. Once they were inside, Emily pulled her elbow away from the nurse. She shouted, "Mommy!" and ran towards a random cluster of people standing in the middle of the waiting room. And she ran right through them and then out the other side of the waiting room and down the hallway. Immediately, out of sight of the nurse, she stopped running and started walking very calmly and assuredly, like she knew just where she was going, which happened to be the next fire alarm. She pulled it as she walked by. And after that, there was a good, healthy burst of pure pandemonium. Chaos as the staff scrambled to start clearing out the patients. Security arrived and started giving orders contradictory to the doctors, which led to a nice, healthy amount of tension in the air, which gave Emily plenty of time and cover to find a nice office with a lockable door and a working computer. She had no problem at all getting access to the hospital files. And within 7 minutes, she was leaving that office and walking downstairs to the morgue with the next keystone in her plan fully formed. She had learned there were 8 bodies in the morgue currently. One of them was named Gerald Poffo, age 29, riddled with STDs and 2 different strains of hepatitis, dead of a drug overdose. But it wasn't so much Gerald Poffo that interested her, so much as the fact that his father was elderly, a widower, and lived locally. She knew which drawer Poffo's corpse was in and which locker held his personal belongings. Thanks to the ongoing panic from the fire alarm, there was no security guard outside the morgue. Unfortunately, there was someone else there. So this may sound like an understatement at this point, but Emily Mason is crazy smart. She's unmeasurable by science smart. She can score whatever she wants on any intelligence, personality, or psychological test you give her. She can score whatever she decides will work best for her. She had an eidetic memory, total recall of any book she'd ever read, any conversation she'd ever heard. And with all of that, her greatest strength was being able to read people. Emily could surmise so much information about a person instantaneously and then adapt her persona and her approach to fit that person, to fit that situation. So when Emily saw a young woman in a casual nun's habit praying over one of the bodies, Emily didn't panic, she just adjusted her plan.
Is that my dad?
She burst into tears, knowing full well that the corpse she would claim to be her father was 2 drawers away still. "Oh no, my child," the nun said. "No, no, no, you shouldn't be down here."
It's the last time I'll get to see him. Please, just give me a moment alone with him, please.
The woman's name was Sister Lakea. She was fresh-faced, here to make a difference and bring the light of Jesus Christ into people's lives. Her good nature and kind heart were absolutely no match for Emily. And she found herself stepping outside the room for a few minutes to give the girl some privacy. It wasn't long, but it was long enough for Emily to open up the right drawer and get an actual look up close of Dad before she went through his locker and slipped a small item into her pocket. When Sister Lakea returned, she found the little girl wiping tears off her face and shutting the corpse drawer. The nun hugged her, and Emily embraced her back with all of her might. She didn't cry, but she hitched her breath to make it feel like she was silently sobbing. The nun stroked her hair. "Where's your mom, honey?" she asked. And like that, Emily sprung her trap.
My mommy's at work. She's a dancer at a club. My Uncle Zeke brought me here. He's up there waiting for me. He says I'm real pretty, and I can dance like Mommy does. But I don't want that. He's mean to me. He makes me dance for him. He touches. Never mind. I always prayed to Jesus that Daddy would rescue me, but now he can't. Will you help me?
And that is how Emily got a nun to sneak her out of the hospital, away from the eyes of the law, past the DRO, and into an abused woman's shelter for her to safely stay the night. Emily played the innocent but broken child to a T. She was all big eyes and sniffling sadness. There was a surprisingly tasty dinner, after which Emily showered and changed into the gross but clean clothes that Sister Lakea had provided. And then she laid down on a cot, faux grateful, in a room filled with quiet and broken women. The nun sat behind her and brushed her hair and quietly sang hymns to her. Tomorrow, we will figure out how to help you best, the nun said. Emily looked at all the faces and counted all the women in the room who could so very easily never wake up again. Instead of counting sheep, she fell asleep by counting lucky ducks. She smiled as she drifted away. Sister Lakea proved to be as resourceful as she was kind. Quietly and without raising any eyebrows, she found out the identity of Emily's father, and from there she tracked down that man's only living relative, Vincenzo Paffo, on home care at the tender age of 67. It had taken her 3 days to find out what Emily learned in 7 minutes. Sister was quite proud of herself, but Emily did not laugh. She couldn't be rude to someone who was doing so much for her. The nun took her to Vincenzo's house to provide an introduction. This was a very unusual circumstance. If Sister Lakea was a state social worker or even a more old-school type of nun, it would not have played out this way. But Emily had given the naive woman of faith enough halting, sniveling, disgusting details to convince her that she was being groomed for a life of prostitution by a man who was unquestionably a pimp and a child molester. The nun had also been subtly made aware that these unsavory people were probably still looking for Emily. And so for now, it was imperative that things stay quiet. At first, it seemed like Vincenzo did not give a fuck about this story. But it turns out that a stroke some months ago had left his face stuck in one fixed position, more or less. In fact, he was very moved, especially when Emily reached into her pocket at just the right moment and pulled out a beat-up snapshot showing a young Gerald Paffo hugging his mother by the side of a lake. Seeing that, a single tear rolled down the old man's leathery cheek. Vincenzo had lost everyone he had ever loved. And this girl was now the last person left in his bloodline. Now there was this beautiful, damaged child, a lifeline, the last thread of his legacy. It could not have possibly gone any better. Emily delicately embraced the old man, who reeked of onions and foot powder, and she swore to him that they would be a family. They would help each other. And I'm not crying, and you're not crying, But you damn sure better know that Sister Lakea was crying, as was Vincenzo, and Emily was pretending to go along, but she was really just laughing at the folly of all this. See, for her, the joke was that Emily was going to come by and visit this old man and give him this exact same song and dance anyway. But by finding this wonderful nun and recruiting her to do it, it gave the whole bullshit story another layer of legitimacy. A few hours later, Sister Lakea left, with a promise to return soon with more clothes and a list of phone numbers for people that could help Emily out. But for the time being, all three of them agreed Emily needed to stay inside and wait for this trouble to blow over. In a few weeks, then they would see about getting her into school or talking to the police, finding her a regular doctor and dentist, and so on. Vincenzo was still mobile, just very limited. He owned a 2-story house, but could no longer climb those stairs. Other than that, he was quite independent. Aside from a housekeeper who came by twice a week and a home care nurse who visited him every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Emily learned all of the routines, and she absorbed as much information and data as she could. She read newspapers, she watched the TV, news programs, listened to the radio, absorbing as much about the world as she could. Being locked away in that cage for so many months, she felt out of touch. Vincenzo didn't have a computer or anything connected to the internet, which would have been a big help to her. For a while, the news talked about Grace and all the dead people they found there. But Emily never heard her own name mentioned, or Benji's. They said that Gordo and Obi and Miss Mercy and the machinist were all dead, but there weren't any other names that she recognized. She knew that the DRO was going to tightly control all of the information that got out about that night. And she was confident that in the process they would cover for her as well. Emily and Vincenzo played a lot of games. They played checkers, chess, cribbage, Chinese checkers, and cards. Emily made sure to lose 75% of the time for the first few days, and then she slowly increased the win ratio so that the old man could feel like she was learning from him. She needed to keep that emotional bond very tight, because she was aware that the old man was not as foolish as the nun. He still had a lot of unanswered questions, and it wasn't that he was suspicious at all. Why the hell would he be suspicious of a 10-year-old girl? But Vincenzo Paffo was the type of man who did not like unanswered questions, and this could prove to be a problem for her. For the first month Emily was there, Sister Lakea came by every few days. She always brought supplies and always brought pamphlets. Whenever she tried to broach any real sort of topic, Emily would gently hit her with some Bible quotes, claiming that she had been studying the Bible that the sister had given her, and that always worked. Time dragged. Emily felt like she was in purgatory, having to be a good girl, not being able to play with dollies. Over time, it was affecting her mind state. She felt herself starting to get careless out of pure frustration. She thought a lot about her Benji boy. She wondered if he'd woken up or if he was still hibernating. Funny thing is that as smart as Emily was, She never once, not even briefly, entertained the notion that Ben would not wake up. Even with the blood loss and the fire and the army of cops, she clung to the idea that Benji was going to be okay. Because he just had to be. He was her only real friend. Playing games with this awful, smelly old man just made her miss the misshapen giant all the more. At this point, over 2 months had gone by. And then she saw a report on the evening news that made her heart start to sing. There had been a series of Bigfoot sightings near the Grace Valley.
Benji? Oh my God. Benji, I'm coming to find you.
She was so tired of hiding and waiting. But she hadn't anywhere to go. She hadn't a direction in which to aim herself, not until she saw that story. Then she felt energized. Being so bored and so cooped up for so long, Emily had worked out multiple plans. She had them fully developed. So she didn't need a lot of time to figure out her next move. Before she could move, there were just 2 loose threads that needed to be tied up. The old man and the nun. They were the only people who cared, who might actually look for her, who might actually ask questions, who might actually draw attention and potentially point the DRO in the right direction. So, obviously, they needed to be made quiet forever. The very thought of it made Emily tingle in her fingers and her toes. It felt like a million, jillion years since she'd really cut loose, and there were a lot of weird, jumbled feelings bouncing around in her head right now. So many bad things that she wanted to do, but instead, she was smart. She brewed a cup of tea and invited the old man to come and sit at the table and play Chinese checkers with her. Within a few moves, he was completely paralyzed.
I want to play. Really, I do. I want to cut your tendons. Watch you make wiggle worms on the floor. I want to pin your saggy face back. Make it nice and smooth to practice makeup. I want to make you pretty, like the butterfly woman in my dreams. Peel the skin off your back and stretch it into the beautiful wings. But I can't. Not tonight. I hope you liked your tea.
By this point, Vincenzo Paffo was already dead. Emily slept very well that night. Finally, she had something to look forward to. The next morning, she called the housekeeper and the home care nurse to inform them of a mild stroke that had sent Vincenzo back to the hospital. She said that she would let them know when he came back home. Then she called Sister Lakea and asked her to come over right away. She said it was important, hoping that her tone of voice would be enough to get the naive nun to come running and not tell anyone where she was off to. Then she booked a car for later that afternoon. To cover her tracks, because it would be very unusual for a 10-year-old girl to call for a car service, she used the special system that phone companies used to have for deaf mutes. A few years ago, not everyone had texting and smartphones, so a deaf mute or any disabled person who was unable to use a phone could work with a special operator that would read your words and be your voice to whoever was on the other end of the line. Using this, she was able to take Vincenzo's identity and his credit cards and book a ride for his sweet granddaughter to travel to Grace. Sister Lakea arrived, and she was worried sick. What's wrong? What happened? Where's Vincenzo?
It turns out it's not as bad as I thought. Let me go get him so we can all talk. Here, I made you some tea.
Emily went to use the potty, and when she came back, the nun was slumped over. Emily crawled up onto her lap and straightened her up so they could look eye to eye.
Hi. It's okay. Don't be scared. I'm being a very good girl. I have to be. Because if they start looking for me, I won't be able to find Ben. So, I'll be quick, and I'll be quiet. Super promise. I once knew a man who taught me how to choke someone with their own tongue. Can I show you?
It was a nice car ride. She got to see hundreds of acres worth of scorched earth and skeletal trees. It made her beam with pride. I did that. Once she arrived, things moved quickly. She followed the names and areas mentioned in the news article until she found an old woman who had served tea and cookies to Bigfoot. The newsman had thought her demented, but Emily knew better. From there, she followed the trail of 3 young men who were shooting a documentary about Bigfoot. She knew that they probably wouldn't find Ben, but Ben would probably find them. Which he did. And from their blood-soaked corpses, it was very easy to track her big friend's red footprints through the woods. And finally, at long last, she saw him. The giant, the monster man-child who was her best, truest, and only friend, who was wearing a luchador mask, covered in green and brown sequins.
Benji! Benji!
They ran, and he scooped her up in his arms and swung her around. They shrieked. They laughed. They cried. They hugged until their arms were tired.
Ben, what in goodness sake are you wearing?
Thank you for listening to another episode of A Scary Home Companion. Follow the show on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can always email me directly at ascaryhomecompanion@gmail.com. Head over to the show's Patreon page right this very minute and watch the post-mortem analysis video that digs deep into the references, inspirations, connections, and future portents of this story. And every new story. Thanks go out to the show's current patrons: Catherine, Carol, Kevin, Buck, Joseph, Monica, Eric, Andy, Matt, and newest patron, Ashley. Join them. The episode was edited and produced by Jeff Davidson, with a special guest starring appearance by Savannah Hensley. I'd like to give special thanks to longtime listener Patrick Daniel. Music this time around was by Matt Sekal. The Nox Boys, Filmy Ghost, Worse, and Chelsea Oxendine with the theme music.